Okay, so here we're continuing our discussion of AUC Section 260 for communications with those charged with governance. And this video will be our first one that is of the requirements in this AUC section. So first it discusses how to define who those people are that are charged with governance, and it says we should determine the appropriate person or persons within the entity's governance structure with whom to communicate. And typically in larger entities, there will be a board of directors, and there may be a subgroup of those charged with governance that are in charge of the audit, for instance, the audit committee. And so if we communicate with a subgroup of those charged with governance, then we should determine whether we should communicate with the overall governing body as well. And of course, all this takes professional judgment. And also there may be the case where those charged with governance are also all of the members of management. So in some cases, all those charged with governance are involved in managing the entity. And for instance, a small business, maybe the owner manages the entity, but he also has a governance role, and no one else has that particular role. So in those cases, if we've already communicated what we need to, that's discussed later in this section, then we don't need to communicate that information twice to the same person. But we should nonetheless be satisfied that our communication with that person in management adequately informs all of those that we're required to communicate to that would have a governance capacity. So we have some explanatory sections here that's going to help us identify who it is within the entity that we're supposed to communicate to that's involved with governance, and that's at sections A6 through A12. So let's go down to those sections now in the explanatory material section. Okay, so now we're down in the explanatory material, and governance structures vary by entity. So in larger entities, we might see a more formal structure, for instance, a board of directors with several committees and such. But also we may come across smaller entities who have less formal governance structures, for instance, a single owner manager who both manages the entity and also governs the strategy of the entity as well, which would qualify under those charged with governance. So it says here that in some entities, those charged with governance hold positions that are integral parts of the entity's legal structure. For other entities, a body that is not part of the entity is charged with governance, as with some governmental agency. And also, in some cases, some or all of those charged with governance also have management responsibilities, and others, those charged with governance and management are different people. So maybe the CEO of the entity, who is a member of management, also sits on the board, so he would have roles of both management and also those charged with governance. And also in the case of governmental entities, those charged with governance may include members or staff of a legislative oversight committee, oversight bodies, or other parties contracting for the audit. So they may not be within the entity at all. They may be part of a legislative body. But in most entities, governance is the collective responsibility of a governing body, such as board of directors, supervisory board partners of the entity, proprietors, which would be a single owner of the entity, or a committee of management trustees or equivalent persons. But in smaller entities, one person may be charged with governance, such as the owner-manager, when there are no other owners or a sole trustee. But when governance is a collective responsibility, a subgroup, such as an audit committee, or even an individual, may be charged with specific tasks to assist the governing body in meeting its responsibilities. So there may be a single person on the board of directors, for instance, a treasurer, maybe, who is responsible for the audit. And they're telling us all of this because the diversity of different companies and organizations and the way that their governance is structured makes it difficult for this section to direct specifically who we need to communicate with. And we may not even be able to clearly identify who that person is. And for instance, in family-owned entities or some nonprofit organizations or government entities, that governance role may not be specified. And when that's the case, we may need to communicate with the entity and find out who is the appropriate person with whom we need to communicate. And we would need to utilize Section 315, understanding the entity and its environment, to help us to learn who that particular person or group of people is. In addition, Section 600, AUC Section 600, Special Considerations for the Audits of Group Financial Statements, includes information that needs to be communicated to group auditors with those charged with governance. So we need to be aware of that section as well. For instance, when the entity that we're auditing is a component of a group, the appropriate person with whom to communicate depends on the nature of the matter to be communicated and the terms of the engagement. So if we're the auditor of the component, we may not communicate directly with the board of the overall entity, but we may communicate with the auditors of the overall group. And so we may come across entities that are large and have, for instance, an audit committee within the board of directors. And so when we're considering communicating with a subgroup of those charged with governance, we want to take into account matters such as the respective responsibilities of the subgroup and the governing body. Like we wouldn't want to communicate with, for instance, the compensation committee of the board if there's actually an audit committee. We want to consider the nature of the matter to be communicated, so we want to communicate matters that are relevant to that particular subgroup. We also want to consider the legal and regulatory requirements of those communications. So if it's something that's important or warrants the entire board knowing about it, we might want to communicate with the entire board rather than the subgroup. And also we want to consider whether that subgroup we're planning to communicate with would be able to take action regarding the information that we're communicating, or would be able to provide us information that's relevant to what we're trying to accomplish. And if not, we might need to communicate with someone else. We also need to be aware of potential conflicts of interest between the subgroup and other members of the governing body. And so when we're deciding whether or the need to communicate information in full or summary form with the governing body, we might be influenced by our assessment of how effectively and appropriately the subgroup communicates relevant information with the governing body. So if the subgroup is not very good about relaying important information to the governing body, it might be good for us to communicate with the overall body as well. And so we may make explicit in the terms of our engagement that we retain the right to communicate directly with the governing body if that's the case. And finally, audit committees or similar subgroups exist in many entities, and although specific authority and functions of audit committees may differ, communication with the audit committee when one exists is a key element in the auditor's communication with those charged with governance. So good governance principles suggest that we have access to the audit committee as necessary, that the chair of the audit committee and when relevant, the other members of the audit committee meet with us periodically, and also the audit committee meets with us without management present, at least annually. That way we can communicate freely information that might be about management.